I'd really appreciate if you went and followed my Twitch channel at twitch.tv/stevis5. The link is in the description below. Also, I'd appreciate if you subscribe to my YouTube channel. Enjoy the video. Welcome to today's stream. So today I'm going to be live with analysis of Game 1 of the World Chess Championship that started today between Magnus Carlsen, the defending world champion, and Jan Nepomniachtchi, the challenger. Now, Nepomniachtchi won the candidates tournament recently, earlier this year, to qualify to play Carlsen. In this first game, Carlsen had the black pieces and Nepomniachtchi had the white pieces. So let's take a look. Nepomniachtchi started with 1e4. So there was a lot of speculation as to what both players might do. I think a lot of people thought Nepomniachtchi might not necessarily start with 1e4. He's played c4 a lot successfully. Also, of course, he could play d4. We could even get knight f3, possibly. But he did play e4. And again, as to Carlsen's first move, I think there was a lot of speculation. I think a lot of people expected him to play c5, the Sicilian, actually, which he used many times in his last World Championship match in 2018 against Fabiano Caruana. But he did play e5. Nepomniachtchi played knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, so we reached the Spanish, and a6, bishop a4, knight f6. This is the Roy Lopez castles, bishop to e7, rook to e1, b5, bishop b3. So I'm going through this all pretty quickly. Here, the move that's most common is to play d6, but Carlsen castled, which could transpose. It's not changing things up that much. Probably not much of a surprise to Nepomniachtchi. Maybe the first slight surprise was the move h3, which Nepomniachtchi played. As you can see in my notes, Nepomniachtchi only played h3 once in his entire career, which was 15 years ago, when he was, I don't even know how old, probably a teenager. I'm not sure exactly. So Carlsen was maybe a little surprised by this. That being said, he has faced it before. The main move here, or the move that's the most common, is the move c3, which Nepomniachtchi never played, so I'm not sure that Carlsen necessarily expected this. But Carlsen has faced it. For example, I included a game that he played against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave earlier this year, which had the following moves. I'm just going to go through it pretty quickly. And this is the position that they got, and the game went on. It ended up being a draw. So, going back, another possibility that maybe Carlsen expected here is a4, which was suggested by Wesley So, who was one of the commentators. And Wesley So's actually had this position many times with both colors. He's played it against Nepomniachtchi and against Carlsen. So I included a game where he played against Carlsen with white. So he is sort of playing in the role of Nepomniachtchi in this game. And a game where he played against Nepomniachtchi with black. So he's sort of playing in the role of Carlsen in this game. So here is his game against Carlsen. Again, I'm just going to go through this pretty quickly. So this is what happened. Carlsen got a better position with the black pieces. It ended up being a draw. Again, this is a game from 2021, so earlier this year. And here's his game against Nepomniachtchi. Again, So is black, Nepomniachtchi with the white pieces. And Nepomniachtchi got a better position with white and actually converted it. This is a game from Jerusalem in 2019. So just an interesting note on the side. Maybe there is a reason why Nepomniachtchi didn't choose to play a4, even though he had success with it in the past. Possibly he thought that Carlsen was well prepared against it. So anyway, he chose h3, and here was the first really big surprise of the game. Carlsen played the move knight a5. Now, knight a5 has only been played, at least according to my database, 4 times ever in master games. So this was definitely a shocker. Now, this is definitely a sign that Carlsen heavily prepared for this match. This is a pawn sacrifice, something very unusual. So Carlsen clearly came to this game very well prepared. The main move, I should say here, is simply bishop b7. And Carlsen actually played this move twice in his 2016 World Championship match against Sergei Karyakin. So this was probably what Nepomniachtchi was expecting. And one of those games went d3, d5, e takes, knight takes e5, knight d4, knight c3, knight b4, bishop f4, and actually, despite, again, sacrificing a pawn, Carlsen did get a slight advantage in that game, but it ended up being a draw. So he did play knight a5 in this game, and Nepomniachtchi played knight takes e5, which is the correct move. You are supposed to take the pawn, because if you don't take the pawn, well, then you're just losing your bishop and not getting anything in return. So knight takes b3, a takes b3, bishop b7, d3, d5, takes, and here Carlsen played an interesting move, queen takes d5. Now the main move, or at least the main move in the very few games that have been played here, is knight takes d5. But queen takes d5 is an interesting option, and here Nepomniachtchi played queen f3. Carlsen played bishop d6. Now this is a tricky move because it does have ideas for black to go queen takes e5. Now queen takes e5 attacks this queen. And firstly, let's say here if white plays knight c3, for example, then queen takes e5, rook takes e5, bishop takes f3 is played, and after you capture the bishop, you lose your rook, so you'd have to move the rook away, but then you're just down a full piece. Additionally, if you take on b7, then you actually just get checkmated. After queen takes e1, the king has no escape. Even if the king did have an escape, however, white would still be completely lost here because black is just up a rook. So this was something to keep in mind. Now, one thing I would like to point out is that in this position, Nepomniachtchi, well, firstly, he could have taken on d5, and that's the move that had been played in the one game that I could find from this position. This was a game between two grandmasters. It was played 15 years ago, and it went queen takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop d2, f6, knight f3, knight e7, knight d4, c5, knight e2, knight g6, knight bc3, and the game continued. White ended up winning. So it's interesting, maybe Nepo or Nepomniachtchi should have chosen to play this, because white did manage to win the one game played here. But instead, in the game, he played king f1, which is a novelty because it has never been played before. And this was a very important point in the game. Now, Carlsen had a lot of moves to choose from. In the game, as a spoiler, he did end up playing rook f to b8, which simply defends the bishop, so that now you can try to move the queen and open up this discovered attack. But one option here was actually to play the move queen takes e5, because the point of king f1 was to defend this rook, so that now on queen takes b7, there's no longer queen takes e1 checkmate. But there is a tricky move, queen to h2, And this is something that Carlsen probably considered, because now white's king is a little open. There's always a queen h1 check idea. Probably the reason he ended up dismissing it is that for now, this queen does just defend g2, so you can't simply go queen h1 takes g2, because the pawn is defended. And he must have felt that Nepomniachtchi was going to get in, let's say, bishop e3. He can always put the king on e2 if he wants. Maybe knight c3 or knight d2, and white would just solidify. Also, I think that Carlsen felt that this type of position is more in the style of Nepomniachtchi, who's kind of a sharper tactical player, rather than Carlsen's style, as Carlsen is a more solid positional player. So he didn't play queen takes e5. Instead, he played rook fb8. And I believe that this was the point that Nepomniachtchi was out of his preparation. I think he did clarify this in the press conference. I didn't exactly catch what he said, but at this point in the game, he spent a lot of time. And here there's basically only one move for white, which is queen takes d5, because black has all kinds of threats. They can, again, go queen takes e5, because now you can't take on b7 because it's defended. So that's a problem. But also, black has other ideas. They can just move the queen to many squares, like queen to c5 is possible, for instance, opening up this attack. So it's really important to get the queens off the board so you don't have to deal with this annoying bishop opening up. So queen takes d5 was played. But one thing I will say is that Nepomniachtchi did spend a lot of time on this move. So clearly this was probably not preparation. He would have, I think, played it a queen takes d5 immediately if he had already looked at this. So knight takes d5 was played, bishop d2, and c5. And now another interesting moment, because I think that this was the point where Carlsen's preparation ended. Now, of course, we can only speculate, but after this point, Carlsen did start to spend a lot more time. And also one of the commentators, Anish Giri, said that probably Carlsen had looked up to this point and decided that at this point, after c5, black has a lot of compensation for the pawn that they are down. Because if we remember back in the opening, when Carlsen played knight a5, he did give up a pawn with knight takes e5. So Nepomniachtchi is up a pawn here, but Carlsen probably felt like the two bishops and the activity of all of his pieces would give him compensation. So knight to f3 was played by Nepomniachtchi. And now Carlsen played rook to d8. Here, as I said, Carlsen spent some time, and there were definitely a lot of options. One thing that was suggested by Fabiano Caruana, one of the commentators, was the move h6, which looks kind of like it's not really doing that much, but there is a very interesting idea behind it. So it stops white from putting a piece on the g5 square. It also creates a square for the king, if that's ever necessary. And it prepares the idea of going f5 and maybe even g5 and really going for an attack. Because if you play f5 right away, then it really weakens the g5 square, and that could be a problem. So h6 is a really interesting option. Another option that the computer suggests is knight to b4, and this doesn't allow white to simply develop in a normal way, as they did in the game. After rook d8, Nepomniachtchi played the move knight to c3. But on knight b4, knight c3 is not possible because the c2 pawn is hanging. So now white has to play an awkward move like rook c1 and try to defend. One thing I should say is that this move is really important, because if you give white a little time to go, let's say, knight c3, knight e4, and really stabilize, then white is clearly better, because they are just up a pawn. So, in the game, rook d8 was played, knight c3, and here, Carlsen chose to play knight b4. So knight c3 wasn't the only move, I should say, and there were some other interesting options. One thing that Caruana and some of the other commentators were looking at is the move bishop to a5. And bishop to a5 does attack the rook, but there's another idea behind it that's very interesting, which is to put the knight on d2. And with the knight on d2, knight b4 isn't necessarily as much of a problem. You can take, or you can just defend the pawn, and the knight is very quickly coming to e4. Additionally, it's just awkward as to where to put this rook. Carlsen decided to put it on d8, and now he has to move it again. And if we look at from the beginning of this game, first the rook was on h8, then he castled, it moved to f8, and then to b8, and then to d8, and then it would have to move again. So that's a lot of moves with one piece. And an example line here is rook d7, a logical move, just keeping the rook on the d file, then knight bd2, and here it would be important for black to go knight b4, but the knight is still coming to e4 pretty quickly, and also, especially without a rook on the e file to put pressure on it, this could just really stabilize white's position. Additionally, another option for black would be to go knight f4, which makes sense because the bishop no longer attacks that square, but now knight e4 again is super annoying because you have to move the bishop away and white just has a nice position. Now, I should also mention a very interesting idea that was brought up by Maxime Vacher-Lagrave, another top grandmaster, when he was doing commentary, which is the very counterintuitive move here, king to e2, the bomb cloud, right? You're bringing your king into the center, and this looks very weird, but it's actually a very interesting idea to just bring the king to d1, and now black never has any of the attacking ideas I was talking about earlier. They could still play them, but that would be weakening their own king much more than white's king, which would be safe on d1. So, anyway, Nepomniachtchi ended up playing knight c3, knight b4, and rook ec1 was played here. Personally, I slightly prefer rook ac1, just because I feel like the rook on the open e file is an important piece, and if you play rook ec1, you're saying that you'd rather have this rook on the semi-open a file than having a rook on the fully open e file, and I'm not sure that I agree with that, because this rook is staring at this a6 pawn, which is defended 3 times. So this pawn is not going to be a weakness in the foreseeable future. So rook ac8 was played by Carlsen, and now knight e2, a nice move by Nepomniachtchi, and here, white's idea is to play either d4 right away or c3 followed by d4. And if white can get this in, then their position becomes a lot better because they're starting to really take control over the center and their pawns become a lot less weak. So knight c6 was played here. And here, Nepomniachtchi played the move bishop e3, which I think is a little imprecise, because here, so the bishop ended up being attacked. Carlsen played knight e7, preparing to put the knight on f5 to attack this bishop. And I think bishop f4 was maybe a little more precise here, because now knight e7 doesn't target this bishop anymore. And black doesn't really want to trade bishops. Keep in mind, they are down a pawn, and also they don't really want to get rid of their bishop pair. But if they play a move like bishop f8, then Nepomniachtchi could play a simple move, even like rook d1. And now if you go for knight e7 again, try to put this knight on a better square, then d4 just comes immediately, and white is clearly better. And another option was, as I said earlier, to play c3 and prepare d4, but Carlsen would be able to counter this, for example, just knight e5, very simple. You're attacking this pawn, If the knights are traded, then there's pretty much just no way to defend this pawn. So bishop e3 was played, and here Carlsen played knight e7. And this was a very important moment in the game. Nepomniachtchi played the move bishop f4, which is really just a big mistake. And it may not look like that to most people. Bishop f4 is kind of a natural move. Knight f5 is annoying because it attacks the bishop, so you want to put it on a better square so that knight f5 doesn't attack it. But at this level, this is a very big mistake. And here, probably the move that Nepomniachtchi should have played is knight g3, which was suggested by Caruana. So this simply stops knight f5, and it may look like, okay, black can take and give you doubled pawns and then go knight f5, but here even simply just bishop f2, and white has a very nice position. This knight isn't actually really doing anything, and you can bring your rook to the e-file now that the rook no longer needs to defend this pawn. White is just clearly better here. So, considering that that's not really an idea, it's hard for black to come up with a plan here. Maybe they want to go knight d5, maybe they even want to put the knight back on b4, but in the meantime, white is going to be able to, again, maybe put the rook on the open e-file, and also try to get this knight to e4. That's one of the benefits of going knight g3, is now you have this idea to play knight e4. You could do it in one go. Also, you could potentially consider going knight d2, and then both knights are controlling this e4 square, so that if this knight is captured, you don't have to take back with a pawn, but you can take back with a knight. So that's an interesting idea. But that was missed by Nepomniachtchi. He played bishop f4, and now Carlsen made a series of trades. And again, it may look like, okay, you did double white's pawns, but white still has an extra pawn, so they couldn't possibly be worse, right? But I actually do think, at least from a human perspective, maybe the computer would disagree, but I do think that white is worse here, because black can just go rook c6, now this a6 pawn is defended, and white just has a ton of weaknesses that black can target. They can go rook f6 at some moment, maybe put the other rook on the 6th rank and put that rook on f6 or h6, or bring the knight in as well to h4 and target this pawn, or to d4. There are really a lot of nice ideas for black here. And Nepomniachtchi played the move rook e1. And I'm not sure that this is necessarily a bad move, but I think that there were other options. One good option was rook to a5. And I think one thing we should note about this position is black has one weakness. White has, I would say, 1, 2, 3. Maybe you could even argue that the c2 pawn's a weakness. These pawns are doubled. So let's just say white has a lot of weaknesses, right? And black only has one. So it's really important that white targets that one weakness. And so now black has some options. One thing I would say is you could play a move like rook f6, but one thing to keep in mind is if you go after the f3 pawn, then white would actually win a6, which is kind of nice for white, because the f3 pawn is worse than the a6 pawn. Once white gets a6, they also get an open file, these pawns become weak, and so white is perfectly fine. So black might play a move like rook d6, just to make sure this pawn's defended, and then they can swing this rook over, but now white can just put their other rook on the a-file, and again, if you go for the f3 pawn, let's say, then white will win the a6 pawn. And I would say this is an example of dynamic neutrality in an endgame. Kind of a fancy term, but what that basically means is that both sides have threats. So both sides are sort of almost in zugzwang here. They can't really do anything more than what they've already done. There's not really a clear way for either side to improve their position. They're kind of just stuck. Right, white, it would be very hard for white to try to find a third way to attack this pawn. It would take this knight very many moves to get to a square where it could attack this pawn. I don't think it's really possible. But at the same time, again, black can't really go after white's pawns because they have to be stuck defending the a6 pawn. So in that way, both sides' weaknesses and both sides' activity kind of cancels out, and it's just equal. So definitely an instructive idea there. And I think if Nepomniachtchi had played rook a5, then that would have probably led to a draw pretty quickly. So knight e2 could have been played as well. And this is also an interesting idea, because now you move the knight out of the way, and when the f-pawn is possibly attacked, you can just play the move f4, and then the f-pawn's defended, and you can bring your king up, maybe king g2, king f3, or king g2, king g3, and then all of your pawns, all of your stuff would basically be defended. So you kind of have just a mini fortress. Hey John, hey Jansel, Jan. How's it going, guys? So yeah, I'm doing some analysis here, as you can see. I'm also going to post this on YouTube, so you can see the full version there. I'll probably post it later today. And I hope you enjoy this. I tried to do some instructive analysis of this game, of this World Championship game. You can see I have a ton of notes here. This is all my notes from watching the game, so I hope you enjoy this. Okay, so going back to the game, here rook e1 was played. Knight to f5, a logical move by Carlsen, trying to get the knight to either d4 or h4 to attack white's weaknesses. And here Nepomniachtchi played the move c3, which is logical because it does stop the knight from coming to d4. But here, it does feel like white's position is really starting to slip, because white just created even more weaknesses, and it feels like white's really going to have to be on the defensive now. So knight h4 was played. And here, one thing I should make note of is that g5 is possible. And g5 is probably a move that would be the first instinct of a lot of people in this position. And I see that Jan in the chat is saying, can't black just play g5? And that's true. And it looks good because now the knight can no longer defend the d3 square. But g5 is actually a weakening move. And after knight h5, first of all, you can't take the pawn because of back rank checkmate. So that's very important. But also, here, my first instinct, I don't know if other people would agree, but my first instinct is to go rook h6, because again, you attack the knight, and if the knight moves, you just win this pawn. But now white has a nice move, rook to e5, and you're attacking this knight. So after a trade, this is nice for white. They're up a pawn, g5 is under pressure, c5 is under pressure, a6 is under pressure. So white is actually just much better here. And also, if you move the knight away, then you lose g5 with check. So that's also bad. So g5, as good as it looks, it actually doesn't quite work out. There are some other lines. So, for example, instead of rook h6, knight h4 is another very natural move. But now white can just hold both pawns with rook e3. And so here maybe black would go f5, right, and go for f4, try to get this rook off this square. But now white has another nice move, rook e7. And here you can kind of see how much g5 has weakened black's position, because now this rook has a lot of open squares to inhibit here near black's king. So after rook takes d3, for example, just grabbing a pawn, you can go rook ae1, and now you're threatening to start giving checks. And this is actually just fine for white, because if their rooks get in, then they have at least a draw, right? So, like, for example, if you take on f3, I could even just go rook g7, king f8 would be forced, because king h8 you just get mated. So king f8, and I can go here, and I'm just going to give a perpetual check. Or, even worse, let's say black tries to play for the win here, I don't know, like rook d2, for example, then they're actually in big trouble, because white could go, let's say, rook here, king e8, and now just like rook a7, and if rook c8, then there's rook g8 check. These types of themes can be very annoying. So white actually gets so much activity that they're playing for the win. So g5 does look like a very natural move, but it's actually just very weakening. So knight h4 is played here, going after the f3 pawn. Rook e3, very logical. And king f8 here was played by Carlsen. I think this was a little imprecise. I think probably a slightly better move would have been g6 here. Just because g6 prevents a white knight from ever coming to h5. From ever coming to h5. Also, the g file will never be a problem. And now black can just slowly build on their nice position. At some point they can go knight f5, really plant the knight there because it's defended, so rook e5 wouldn't really be much of a problem. So this is just a very nice move. One thing I should also make note of here is it might be surprising that these moves like g6 and king f8 are suggested here, or at least that's what I analyzed. But if you play a move like rook f6 here, for example, the problem is knight d5, because you can't take because you get back rank checkmated. Once again, bringing up this theme. And here, let's say you bring your rook back, then white can consider planting the knight with c4, which could be annoying. Another possible move is just to double rooks and renew the checkmate threat. But even just c4, and now the position kind of gets closed down. It's a lot harder for black to ever get to d3 because the knight's in the way. And this knight is actually a pretty good piece. It really ties down these rooks. And white can maybe get activity, bring their rook in. So all of a sudden, this is actually okay for white. So king f8 was played, and here Nepomniachtchi played knight g2. And this is an interesting move. I'm not sure whether this is necessarily a good or a bad move. I think a lot of the commentators were critical of him for playing the move knight g2. But that being said, I would argue that in some ways this move is really smart, possibly even genius. It kind of depends on how far he looked ahead at this point, because you'll see that later on in the game there was a very important maneuver from white, which was bringing the knight from g2 to e3 to c4. And that's not possible if the knight's not on this g2 square. So this may have been very smart, but it may have just been a mistake. It depends on how much Nepomniachtchi saw. So knight f5 was played here, rook e5, just attacking the knight, g6. And so now the knight is planted on the square, this pawn is hanging, and here Nepomniachtchi had a choice of how he wanted to defend this pawn. And he played knight e1, which a lot of the commentators again thought that this was a little dubious. The move that is probably correct here is just king e2 to defend the pawn with the king. And maybe you would think, okay, now black can go rook cd6 and attack this pawn, right? Because the point of knight e1 is to make sure that this pawn is never captured. And now you just have to play knight e1 anyway. But the problem is actually that this pawn is hanging, and now on rook takes d3, this pawn, the a6 pawn, is also hanging. There's also a very nice move here that the computer points out, which is rook to c8. Because these rooks are very annoying when put together, because you can give checks. But now if you give a check, I can just move away with my king, and you don't have time to take this pawn, because your rook is under attack. So you would have to trade, and now the a6 pawn's just weak, and white's up a pawn much better. So king e2 would have been a better move, but possibly he missed all of this. So knight e1 was played, and knight g7 here from Carlsen, preparing to reroute the knight. Also, another idea of this move is to get ready to push the f-pawn, either to f6 to attack the rook, or to f5, just taking space, and then you can bring your king up as well. And Nepomniachtchi kind of stepped into this idea. He played rook e4, and now Carlsen just played f5, attacking the rook. The rook had to move back to e3. Here you might think that Nepomniachtchi would want to keep his rook active with a move like rook h4, but the problem here is the move g5. And after rook takes h7, king g8 traps the rook. So this just loses on the spot. So rook e3 was necessary. He could have, I suppose, put the rook on e2 or e5 instead, but this makes sense, just defending everything. So knight e6, and here he brought the knight back to g2. And as I said, there was a really important maneuver with knight g2 to e3 to c4. So again, this move may have been very smart, or it may not have been very smart, depending on how much Nepomniachtchi saw at this point. Regardless of whether he saw the idea of this maneuver at some point down the line, the knight is still better on g2 than e1, so it is a good move nonetheless. So here Carlsen played b4, which looks reasonable, but I think this is a mistake that Carlsen rarely makes. And maybe it's a little critical of me to call this a mistake. It's a very logical move. You're trying to take, you're trying to go rook b8, really put pressure on these pawns. But I think maybe Carlsen acted a little too fast here, and I'm not sure he needed to play b4 right away. I think he could have sat on his position a little more and slowly improved it. Because now again, Nepomniachtchi has this idea of knight e3 to c4. And that's really important. And maybe the importance of the move knight g2 and the importance of this whole idea is that at some point Carlsen probably would need to go b4 to really put pressure on Nepomniachtchi, which is why this move is so important, because it is sort of prophylaxis against b4. It doesn't completely prevent it, but it creates a safety net in case b4 happens, so that white is able to create counterplay. And here king e2 was played by Nepomniachtchi, bringing his king over to the queen side. And I think this was a really nice idea, because the king should be on the queen side, not on the king side. These pawns are very well defended at the moment, and they're just not the pawns that black is going after. Black is clearly preparing to go after these pawns. So it's really important to bring the king as a defender. So rook b8 was played, and now king d2, another really nice move. And I think this is an idea that a lot of people would overlook, but a really nice defensive idea, which is just to give up the b3 pawn. And that might look really strange, and that's certainly what I thought at first when I looked at this as well, because Nepomniachtchi's one advantage, or at least that's what it felt like, his one advantage is that he was up a pawn, right? And Carlsen had all this dynamic counterplay. And now he's not up a pawn anymore, so you would think he's just worse. But the pawn that he lost was already a weakness, and here he has just enough counterplay to sort of save this position. So Carlsen brought his rook back to b7 here, and now h4 was played. And this is another really nice move from Nepomniachtchi, because this might look like it doesn't really do that much, but it prevents the knight from coming to g5, which is really important, because the knight on g5 could be very annoying to target these pawns at some point. And also just makes sure that this pawn is not as much of a weakness. Now it's defended. And here Carlsen played king f7. And this is a little inaccurate, but it's very deep as to why this move is inaccurate. So this is a logical move. It defends the knight. One thing I should say is the natural move here for black is to go rook cb6, because you think you're infiltrating on the b file. But white can go rook a2, so you don't get rook b2, and you can't go rook b1 because you just lose your knight. So here you would probably want to go king f7 anyway and defend this knight so that this is now possible. But then white has time to just go rook e1, and again, these squares are both defended. So Carlsen decided to sort of just do this in the reverse order, be a little tricky, so that if Nepomniachtchi doesn't play rook e1 here, then he would get in rook c to b6 and just be clearly better. But the thing is that Carlsen had a really, really nice move here, which I think is very hard to see. It's the move a5. And this is truly a very nice move. I think if Carlsen had played this move, honestly, I would say that he would have won the game. And this looks very odd. I mean, I think the first instinct that I had is, why can't you just take this pawn? It looks like a free pawn. And even the computer here says that it's okay to take this pawn, as you can... Or sorry, I guess I have the engine lines on, but you guys can't see it. But the computer is saying it's minus 0.7 if you take on a5, so it's a perfectly fine move. But I analyzed it all the way through, and it's completely winning for black. Because after rook takes a5, there's the nice move, knight d4 check. And this forces the king to move, and you can see the engine bar now goes down after knight d4 check. So, first of all, if you take, then black takes back. This is a discovered check, attacking the rook, so you're just going to lose your rook, and you're going to be down in exchange, completely lost. So that's not an option. And here the only move is king to d1, because if you put the king on d2 or c1, then you blunder knight b3 check, which would be a fork. So king d1 would be the only option. And here, rook b1 check. Now, king d2 is forced. The thing that's so nice about this line is just that pretty much every move is forced here. And now rook c to b6. And I really think this is such a nice idea, because if you take the knight, then you're just getting mated. This is a mate threat. And so what you would have to do here is play like rook a2, but then you lose your rook, because it's hanging. So that's not possible for white. And the other option you would think is to go rook a2 here. But the problem here is knight to b3 check. And this is maybe the part of this idea that's really complicated here. I wouldn't be completely surprised if Carlsen saw until this point and just thought that, okay, maybe we'll get a position like check, take, like king d1, and then this knight has to move, and Nepomniachtchi has an extra pawn, he might get in rook e2, he's actually just completely fine here. Black has some activity, but not enough. You can't take the f-pawn. Well, I suppose you could. It does attack the knight. But then white... Well, here white can go rook e2, and here white can take. So actually you can't take the knight, never mind. Or take the f2 pawn. So, yeah. What I was saying, though, is that knight b3 here is a really nice move. And now you have two options. King c2 and king e2. King e2 loses on the spot to knight c1 check, which picks up this rook. So you have to go king c2. Again, this is all forced. There's no other options. And here, another nice move, rook to c1. This forces the king to b2, and now you can go rook to f1, and you just have a million threats here. Knight c1 check to collect this rook. Rook takes f2 check is a huge problem, hitting the king, hitting the knight. So basically, this is just completely winning for black. And it's just a nice subtlety to play rook c1. Probably you could go rook f1 right away, and maybe black is still better, although the computer is actually saying white has enough to hold here. Although they're still under a lot of pressure. But to play rook c1 first is just really nice, and then rook f1, and black is completely winning. So a super nice line. I wouldn't expect anyone, including Carlsen, to see all of this, but the point is also, of course, white doesn't have to take this pawn. White could play something else, like, let's say, just rook e1, continuing their plan to go knight e3, knight c4, for example. But now after rook a6, black is clearly better, because they just have a plan. They're gonna try to push this pawn up the board. And white can try to blockade, but eventually black is going to be able to get this pawn through. Here there's rook a b6, for example, and now if rook a2, you can go a4 and take advantage of the fact that white can't take, because then black's rooks infiltrate, and you're kind of just getting all of your play in a very nice way. So this was a missed opportunity, and this might have been able to win Carlsen the game, but instead he played king f7, and here Nepomniachtchi played rook e1, just preparing to execute his plan of knight e3 to c4. And now king f6 was played, knight e3, and here Carlsen made probably the final mistake that decided the game. He played the move rook to d7, and this really just gives away the advantage that he had. And here it's important to play the move knight f4, so that you can try to put pressure on the d3 pawn. And there's a really nice idea behind this, probably what Carlsen missed. I'm not completely sure of this, but it's very possible, is here you would think that there's rook a4, and now you force the knight to go back. And this is just nice for white, because then they can double their rooks. But the problem here is the move rook to b2 check. And this is a very nice tactic, because after king takes b2, there's knight takes d3. And now black just wins the rook. Now black's up a pawn, the f3 pawn's super weak, black is just winning. So nice little tactic there that prevents rook a4, and now once again white really has to go on the defensive here. If white tries to go knight c4 and continue their plan, then there's rook e7, a nice move pointed out by Viswanathan Anand, one of the commentators. And now black just trades rooks and they get a nice endgame. And one of the many ideas if white tries to go active and threaten rook b7, now you can just go h5. Take this pawn off the weak square where it could be captured by a check, and now you can go for knight g2, and this pawn is super weak. So this is not winning for black, but black is better, and Carlsen would be able to press this advantage on for very long. So rook a2 is also possible here to try to defend. Just defend against any infiltration, any problems, but now black can try to go after this pawn. And after something like this, black can just defend their a7 pawn, attack the d3 pawn, and you're just threatening to go knight takes d3. And that's like a big problem for white here. So black, this rook is really important because black does the duty of both defending the a6 pawn and attacking the d3 pawn. So that being said, Carlsen in the game played rook d7, which is a mistake. And now knight c4 was played. And now Nepomniachtchi is doing perfectly fine. That being said, one thing I should point out is he did go knight c4, sort of executing the final step of his plan, but what he overlooked here is rook a4, and now white is actually playing for a win, because this does actually prevent knight f4 now, and you're just preparing to double rooks and put pressure on this a-pawn, and that's really annoying. Also, a very important issue with this for black is if they double rooks, this is actually just lost for black. This is just a very natural move, right? Putting pressure on the pawn, because how else would you do that now that you can't go knight f4? But the problem here is actually the move knight to c4. And after knight... Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. After knight c4, then there's rook takes d3. That's kind of the natural move for black to play. But the problem here is that there's rook takes a6. And now this knight is in a pin, and it's just going to be lost. There's no way for black to prevent material loss here. So if black can't play the natural move, then it actually starts to become very unpleasant for black to defend against this threat. And Nepomniachtchi could have actually played for a win. He might have won this game. I still think it probably would have been a draw, but he could have played for a win. Instead, he decided to make the draw. He played knight e5, and once again here he had an opportunity to go back to e3, and then if Carlsen just repeated moves, which is kind of natural, then he could play rook a4. But he did not. He played knight e5, and we got a repetition of moves here. This isn't super surprising. It is a little disappointing for chess fans that we got a draw in this game, because at the end of the day, Nepomniachtchi could have played for a win. It's very understandable that he didn't. It is his first game in the World Chess Championship, so it's a big deal. He was probably super nervous and just okay with a draw against the reigning world champion. But this really sets the stage for this to be a very interesting match. This first game included a lot of chances for both players, and I hope you enjoyed the analysis.